strategy is the focus of our conversation, in the light of what the Institute of the Study for War said about a sort of breakdown at the heart of Russian communication right now. Why is that happening, do you think?
Well, I think that the problem is that the Kremlin simply is finding it increasingly difficult to isolate the Russian population from the reality of what's going on the ground in Ukraine. And although everyone was surprised to hear Zaharova's comment, I think it still gives the Kremlin a little bit of space to potentially shift the narrative as they need to find new ways to justify to Russian domestic audiences the fact that the so-called special military operation, which they had promised would last for only a couple of weeks, it's dragging on into a protracted war. And so it's just an acknowledgement that they cannot monopolize the information space anymore.
So there has been an amendment to an existing law which says you can't criticize the army, to extend that to say you can't criticize private military organizations, i.e. the Wagner mercenaries. Is this all about that issue of trying to control the actual narrative within Russian borders?
Well, I think that's one of the biggest concerns currently of the Kremlin, because independent actors, well, semi-independent actors such as the Wagner Group, have tried to inject their own narrative and break that monopoly that the Kremlin thought it had over the narrative of the war. Think, for example, of that time that Wagner, Prigozhin, the head of Wagner, directly challenged the Ministry of Defense for not providing ammunition in time, and that resulted in lots of losses among combatants within the Wagner Group. So I think it's just signals a growing concern by the Kremlin that they cannot monopolize the information space anymore, and trying to put back in the place the people that try to fragment that monopoly.
Prigozhin, as you mentioned by name, the man who is the head of the Wagner Group, said to be close to Vladimir Putin, but some of the things that he has said regarding Kremlin bureaucracy and regarding the military slowing down the supply of ammunition seems to be very hurtful to the image, possibly a false image, I think it's fair to say, that Russia is trying to portray and feed to its domestic audience.
Well, definitely, these are, and it's not just Wagner, right? There's been a growing number of pro-war, actually, voices, especially among the online Telegram communities inside Russia, pro-war military bloggers that have criticized the Russian army for their repeated military setbacks on the ground. And simply the fact that they are allowing themselves to be so vocal in their criticisms against the Kremlin is becoming a source of concern, because it basically they cannot control the narrative about the war anymore, and that provides the space for potential popular discontent, and the Kremlin simply is not ready yet for that problem to emerge and become bigger and bigger.
Jaroslava, what are the possible consequences then for Vladimir Putin if this gets out of his control? Clearly, there are signs that it is becoming something that he can't keep a lid on.
Well, so far, we've seen criticisms mainly directly at the fact that men that have been mobilized have not been receiving sufficient training or adequate equipment. But of course, that growing discontent about the manner in which the so-called special military operations is being carried out could grow into a more anti-war type of dissent. Still, we see that a majority of the Russian population is acquiescing to the war, but nonetheless, the Kremlin, I think, is very nervous about voices that are challenging the state-controlled narrative, and specifically about voices such as Prigozhin, that essentially is controlling a mini army.
Russia is renowned as the kind of the state of propaganda, control of the message, even pushing that message into Western audiences to subvert the Western message as well. It's something that is a past masterhood of Russian propaganda, technology and thought. Is that breaking down?
Well, I just believe that it's being increasingly difficult for them to sustain the old narratives about fighting Nazis. And as you remember, that's how it started. And then as the war became a protracted war, they had to escalate the narrative and talk about an existential confrontation with NATO simply to justify the repeated defeats of the glorified Russian army. And so I just think that they are trying to find new ways to justify to domestic audiences that the war will last for much longer than it had been announced, and that they have to brace themselves in the name of protecting the Russian state, as the Kremlin's narrative goes. And I think you're right. I think that the dominant Russian state narrative is no longer as effective as it used to. But nonetheless, they're still managing to convince a significant portion of the Russian population that it's worth fighting this war.
Indeed. Jaroslava Barbieri of the University of Birmingham, researcher on Russian foreign and security policy in the post-Soviet region. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, and thank you for that analysis of the breakdown of what is happening in terms of the message propaganda that Russia is trying to spin to its people in order to keep them convinced that what they're doing in Ukraine is indeed a just operation, when in fact the truth is out there, but they spent a lot of time trying to suppress that truth getting through to their own people.